want to deal with the issue of zeal or zealousness. But to do that, of course, I've got to tell you a story. So when I was about 13, I grew up in a 2-story home just east of Dallas, about 15 minutes in a small town called Rowlett. And our house was in a neighborhood probably much like many of y'all's, just a kind of normal neighborhood, and we lived on a corner lot, and in front of our house were just rows of bushes. Some were big, some were small. I couldn't tell you what kind they were. Some were pointy leaves, some were not, and that's what our house looked like. We had this kind of rustic, deep maroon brick with a grayish kind of paint on the wooden parts of the house, and that's where I grew up. My father is a good man. He's a great man. He taught me a lot, but he's also a perfectionist. And so if you know anyone that's a perfectionist, if you're related to anyone who's a perfectionist, you understand that at times it can be difficult to please them. Now, I know that my dad is proud of me in a generic sense. In fact, I was talking with him on the phone today, and he was unprompted just telling me how proud he is of me. But when it talks about specific things, it can be difficult to please him. Even when I was a kid mowing the yard, hey, thank you for doing that, but maybe you could go back over that spot over there. Or if we were painting the fence, the list goes on. He owns his own electrical repair company. He just retired and gave the company to my little brothers, which is really cool. But he's just kind of a self-made man, master electrician, devoted to his craft, and that's how we were raised. And so we grew up hunting and fishing and that sort of stuff. And one weekend while he was gone fishing, I just got the energy, right? But he was headed home. I knew he was going to be home in about an hour. And I just got this desire to want to do something that would make him get home and say, wow, thank you, son, for doing that. That's incredible. I didn't expect you to do that. And the thing that came to my mind, and I'm not sure why, was to trim the bushes outside. Well, I am sure why, is because they were unruly. And I know that he was dreading doing that. And so I set out to trim the bushes outside of our home. And I roped my brother into helping me and picking up all the scraps. And so I start to trim the bushes, and I get all the way through all the small ones, and I do a good job. You got to understand, when you're 13, your brain isn't fully developed. And so I didn't think to bring a ladder. But I wanted to get the top of the tallest bush that's there, and so I got on my tippy toes, and I was using an electric hedger. If you're familiar with electric hedgers, they have an oscillating blade like this, and ours was electric, so I had the extension cord and everything, and so I go to trim the tallest bush that we have. I'm on my tippy toes, and I'm using 2 hands at first, and then I switch to 1 hand, and I start to fall. And not thinking, again, brain's not fully developed, right? I tried to catch it. Now, you can't catch when this thing is going. The blades are oscillating. And so it just came right down on my finger. And you can imagine, I won't go into detail. But, part of my finger is falling off, and I'm holding it together. And I have to call my dad. And it's one of those things where, well, maybe I shouldn't say, because maybe some of you have weak stomachs, and I don't want to ruin the chocolate cookies you just ate. It was gruesome. And I had to call my dad, and instead of my dad getting home and being just wowed at this project, he had to rush me to the ER to get 12 stitches in my middle finger on my left hand. And I've still got the scar and the scar tissue to prove it, so if you'd like to see that, see me after service. But all that to say, I had passion, and you could even say that I was zealous to do something for my dad, but just because I was zealous didn't mean it ended up well. It didn't end up right. And zeal is kind of one of those things biblically that I've never really understood. I mean, sometimes you look in the Bible, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's encouraged, sometimes it's discouraged. It feels like one of these ambiguous things that's in the Scripture. And so let's shed some light on that. Zeal, by definition, is great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or objective, I should say. Great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or objective. Biblically speaking, you can just think of it as a burning desire to please God to advance his glory in the world in every possible way. That's what zeal means, literally. But again, we see sometimes that it's bad, sometimes that it's good. So how do we make sense of that? And that's what we're going to try to attempt to do tonight. We'll be in Matthew 26, starting in verse 47, back in the garden. It says this: "While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him.' And he came up to Jesus at once and said, 'Greetings, Rabbi.' And he kissed him. Jesus said to him, 'Friend.' He looked at that man in that moment and called him friend. He said, 'Do what you came to do.' Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus, now we know that that's Peter, he stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it may be so?'" We can see in this story, I'm going to hone in on Peter's response to Jesus' arrest. We can see that he gets very passionate, and in a moment of passion, he grabs the sword and strikes the high priest. And we see Jesus' response to him is that, hey, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I was hoping for. And when I first read this scripture and I was planning out this message, I thought I'd be doing a message on anger. That Peter just got mad and he tried to cut off the ear of the high priest. But as I studied and as I looked at it and just prayed, I realized, man, this isn't anger. This is something different, perhaps something a little deeper. In fact, we see the passage right before they get to the garden. Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples for what's coming, and he says, "I'm getting ready to die, and all of you are going to scatter. Like when the shepherd gets struck, all his sheep are going to scatter." And Peter, defiant as ever, says, "I'm not going to scatter. Even if everyone leaves you, I'm not going to leave you." And Jesus, knowing what's coming for Peter, trying to prepare him for what's coming, says, "Not only are you going to scatter, but you're also going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." We know that takes place a few chapters later. And Peter, at that, doubles down on his efforts, and he says, "Even if I have to die with you, Jesus, I will never betray you. I will never disown you." And so as I studied and thought about it, I realized this is zeal. This is Peter, zealous for his master, his Lord, his friend, trying to do what he thought was right. And that's relatable. If you've walked with Jesus for any amount of time, maybe you have tried to do what you thought was right in an effort to please Jesus. But it doesn't always go well. And so I've got some points here tonight that will help us understand, when is zeal good? When is it not good? How should we place our zeal? When is it misplaced? And so that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Point number 1, zeal is for something, not against someone. Zeal is meant to be for something, not against someone. We can look at Jesus and his life, and it's easy to see that Jesus was zealous. All the time he says, "I must be about my Father's business." He does the will of the Father. That's his whole plan in his life. We have this incredible scene in the temple where, if you'll remember, he makes the whip, he braids it together, and he drives out the people from the temple. He flips the table in this scene, and the disciples are watching, probably a little shocked at what's going on, and they remember the prophecy that zeal for his Father's house will consume him. And he was consumed with zeal, but it wasn't zeal against the people in the temple, right? It was zeal for his Father and for his Father's house. And what he set out to do in general was he was on a zealous mission. He says things like he came to seek and save the lost. And not only was he on a zealous mission to give his life passionately for the sake of those who would follow him, but he also says to us, if you seek to save your life, you will lose it. But if you will lose your life for my sake, you will find it. That is just chocked full of zeal and passion. You can't live that sort of way without living with passion. And just so you know, in that scripture, if you seek to save your life right there is another way of saying like the summary of all your desires and your wants. And what you need to understand is that Jesus never asked us to do something he himself isn't willing to do. And he proved that in that teaching. I want to talk to you about a group called the Zealots. Now, the Zealots were a group of religious Jews, very similar to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They actually show up a couple times in the New Testament. The first time they show up is in Matthew 2:10 with Simon the Zealot. He's actually one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And so now you know what that zealot part means. He was a part of this religious sect of Judaism. It also shows up in Acts chapter 5, verse 37. It talks about, it's that great moment where everyone is upset and thinking what they're going to do with the Christians. And somebody stands up and says, listen, Judas the Galilean, he rose up and took people with him, but then he died and their movement died off, and we should handle the Christians the same way, which here we are, 2,000 years later. And Judas the Galilean was a well-known zealot. But there was a particular sect of the Zealots who were they got their name from being a passionate group of Jews, earnestly committed to the scriptures and the teachings of the rabbis. And there was a sect of them called the Sicaries. If you're familiar with that term, Sicari is actually a name for a dagger, a type of blade. And it got its name from this group within the Zealots that would actually use that knife to assassinate Romans and even Jews that didn't agree with them. I think you can see that they were passionate, but their passion wasn't for something necessarily. It was against people who didn't agree with them. Some people, like the Zealots, and even today, are only driven by confrontation and violence. We see that in Peter in the garden. He goes from sleeping in one moment to slaying in the next moment, cutting off somebody's ear. He's driven by this violence. His passion drives him to violence. We have an example in the Old Testament. In 2 Kings, we learn about a king named Jehu. If you're familiar with Jehu, he was anointed king of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. And immediately upon his inauguration, he goes to start killing. And he takes out the previous king of Israel and then all of his descendants. And then he goes down to Judah, which is the two southern tribes, and kills that king as well. And he takes out that wicked woman, Jezebel, from the Old Testament. That scene is just wild if you're not familiar with it. In 2 Kings, I believe it's in chapter 9, he rides up to her. She's in a tower, and she sees him coming from a long way off. And she says, something along the lines of, are you bringing peace with you? And then he looks up in the window, and she's surrounded by her people that live in the tower as well. And he looks up there and he says, are there any of you with me? Basically, word's gotten around. You know what I'm about. You know what I'm here to do. Are any of you on my side? And he locks eyes with a few of them and I think gets the understanding that they are on his side. And he says, all right, throw her out the window. Wow. And they do. They grab her and they throw her to the ground. And the prophecy that Elijah had prophesied was fulfilled, that her body would hit the ground and that dogs would eat her flesh and she would be remembered no more. Kind of a gnarly scene. But that was Jehu's whole inauguration. It was violence and confrontation, and not all of it was bad. Some of it was ordained, but more on Jehu later. Another example I want to give you is street preachers. And I want to be careful with this because I think we all have different flavors or different opinions about street preachers. I wouldn't consider myself a street preacher, but when I was a missionary at USC, it was on my heart, and as well as several other students that I was discipling at the time, to go down and do street evangelism in one of the darkest places in Columbia, 5 Points. And that's just real. On any given Thursday night, Friday night, it's just full of debauchery and sin and alcoholism and underage drinking. All that is taking place. And it was on our heart to do something about it. And so we would go down, and sometimes we would just proclaim the gospel. Other times we would just try and stop people and talk with them, ask them if they had any questions about the Bible or Christianity, or if there was ways that we could pray for them, and that sort of thing. So I believe there's a place for street preaching. I believe there's a place for open-air evangelism. But I think some people have colored it really bad because they've been driven by, their zealousness has driven them to confrontation and violence. And I think when it becomes more about who we are against than who we are for, something is wrong. And I think that's when zeal gets taken out of whack. And the truth is, some people only feel energized by conflict. They always seem to want confrontation or violence. And I'm not even meaning physical. Sometimes it's verbal. Sometimes it's on social media. I like to call these people keyboard warriors. They got to get on their keyboard and start fighting what they think is their fight to fight. And they're driven by that confrontation and violence. And sometimes it's motivated by the right thing, a passion for Jesus, but not in the right way. It's against somebody rather than for Jesus. So make sure that your zeal isn't against someone, but it is for the Lord. Secondly, I'd like to say that zeal should always lead to obedience. Now, in Jehu's example, it didn't. We find out actually in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 28 reads like this. So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all I had in mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. Great. Your zeal was well placed, Jehu. But the story doesn't end there. It says, yet Jehu was not careful to keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. It goes on to say that as a result of this, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. He began to remove his hand from them in that time because of their disobedience. And so just like Jehu, sometimes we are passionate for the Lord, but there's this disconnect that doesn't always mean we end up walking the way that he desires for us to walk. We see this in Peter's example in the garden, right? He takes the sword and he does something that Jesus wasn't trying to do. He wasn't asking Peter to do that. And in that moment, Peter's zeal got the best of him. And we know that Peter is ultimately reinstated and becomes an incredible force for the church. But in this moment, he fails. Now, it wasn't new. Jesus' life had been threatened before. This wasn't the first time that his life had come under threat. Several times, people had taken up stones to stone him. He said things that were outrageous, and it almost cost him his life several times. We know that Jesus had total control over his life, and he gave it exactly when he meant to. But this wasn't a new thing. But in this moment, Peter's zeal got the best of him. I think even in the example of me trimming the hedges, I had a great heart, and I set out to do something for my Father, but I ended up doing more harm than good. And I think when you think about zealous people, that can be applied. Zealous people, if not careful, can end up doing more harm than good. You might know people like this in your life. You yourself may be like this to some degree. And so my admonishment and our admonishment should be Romans 12:11, which says this: never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. About a week before I was announced as the missions pastor here at Christian Life, I was at an event here in the chapel, and I was worshiping, and then the event took place. And afterwards, a member of the church who didn't know what was coming, didn't know I was going to be announced mission pastor the following Sunday, came up to me and said, "Hey, I've got a word from the Lord for you." I said, "By all means, brother, share it with me." And so he shared with me this verse: to never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. And I started wondering, okay, Lord, what are you trying to say to me through this verse? And I was reminded of a conviction that I have that I can never let serving God replace knowing him. And we as Christ followers should never let serving God replace knowing him. It's like what Paul says in Romans 10, verse 2, "For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge." He's speaking of the Jews there. And of course, Paul would relate to that strongly. He was exactly that verse. He had a zeal for God, but it wasn't according to knowledge. That's why Jesus stopped him on the Samaritan road and said, "You're persecuting me, the one that you're trying to serve. It's actually me." And so I think the way that we avoid letting our zeal not lead to obedience is by making sure that we're in service of the Lord, in service of the King, and not ourselves. Which brings me to my third point, is that zeal can be corrupted by pride. If we're not careful, our zeal becomes more about us than about the one we're supposed to be zealous for. In Jehu's example, in chapter 10, verse 16, he says this. He picks up somebody in his chariot and he says, "Come and see my zeal." Now, a humble man doesn't say, "Come and see my zeal." You're not trying to show off your zeal. And zeal isn't something that we should show off. As a college student, I remember seeing people get on fire for God, but then it became about how far they were willing to go in their walks with God, and it became more about the show that they could put on than their actual heart for the Lord. And I think this happens time and time again if we're not careful. When we are proud of our zeal, we are in a bad place, because zeal becomes a show that I display to impress others. It shows that our zeal is not in the service of God, but in the service of making us look good. And my hope with zeal is that we can come to a place where, like John the Baptist, we can say, "He must increase and I must decrease." It's not about me. It's not about gaining some sort of significance or making people think a certain way about me because I'm so passionate for God. But it needs to be pointed and directed to the Lord. And so those are 3 points I want you to remember. Zeal is meant to be for something, or in our case, Jesus, and not against someone. Zeal should lead to obedience in our lives. It should breed a kind of character formation that turns us into the kind of people Jesus is after, the kind of people that have walked with God. And zeal can be corrupted by pride.